I saw my son-in-law throw my grandson's baby blanket in the trash. Thinking of the boy, I picked it up and took it home. When I unfolded it on the bed, I felt something hard, hidden inside the fabric. Curious, I cut the seam open. What I found made my blood run cold. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Walter, and at 66 years old, I thought I'd seen enough of life's cruelties. I was wrong. Nothing could have prepared me for what I discovered that cold February afternoon, when I watched my daughter-in-law Allison throw away something precious like it was nothing more than garbage. I'd been living alone for 2 years since Martha passed. The house felt too big, too quiet, filled with echoes of a life we'd built together for 43 years. My son Daniel had been trying to get me to sell it, move into one of those senior communities where they organize bingo nights and serve dinner at 4:30. But this house held every memory of Martha, and I wasn't ready to let go of those yet. That's why I tried to visit Daniel and Allison every few weeks. Not just to see them, but to spend time with my grandson Tommy. At 5 years old, he was the brightest light in my increasingly dim world. He had Martha's eyes, the same curious sparkle that used to make her notice things others missed. When I looked at Tommy, I could almost hear her laugh again. The drive to their house in the suburbs took me about 20 minutes from my place downtown. Their neighborhood was one of those perfect planned communities where every lawn looked identical and the mailboxes matched. Daniel worked hard as an accountant to afford living there, and I was proud of what he'd built for his family. I pulled into their driveway that Tuesday afternoon, expecting the usual routine. Tommy would run to greet me, Daniel would offer me coffee that was too strong, and Allison would make polite conversation while clearly wishing I'd leave sooner rather than later. She'd never been particularly warm toward me, but I'd always attributed that to normal daughter-in-law awkwardness. Martha used to say some people just took longer to warm up, but what I saw when I got out of my car made my blood run cold. Allison was standing by the garage, holding something blue and familiar. Even from a distance, I recognized it immediately. It was Tommy's baby blanket, the one Martha had spent months crocheting during the last trimester of Allison's pregnancy. Martha had put so much love into every stitch, working on it even during her final weeks when her arthritis made her fingers ache. The blanket was special in ways that went beyond its sentimental value. Martha had used yarn in 3 different shades of blue, creating a pattern that looked like gentle waves. She'd told me it reminded her of the lake where Daniel learned to swim, where we'd taken him every summer when he was Tommy's age. She'd embroidered Tommy's name in one corner with silver thread, along with the date of his birth. I watched in disbelief as Allison lifted the lid of the large trash bin and carelessly tossed the blanket inside. It landed with a soft thud among the other garbage, and she didn't even pause to look at it. She just slammed the lid shut and walked back toward the house like she'd thrown away an old newspaper. My heart hammered in my chest. I couldn't understand what I'd just witnessed. That blanket had been Tommy's constant companion since birth. He'd dragged it everywhere, slept with it every night, refused to go anywhere without it tucked under his arm. Martha used to joke that the blanket would probably need its own suitcase when Tommy went to college. I sat in my car for several minutes trying to process what I'd seen. Maybe there was an explanation. Maybe the blanket was damaged beyond repair. Maybe they'd bought Tommy a new one and were transitioning him away from the old one. But even as I tried to rationalize it, something felt wrong, very wrong. When I finally went to the front door, Allison answered with her usual forced smile. She was 32, blonde, and always looked like she'd stepped out of a magazine even when she was just lounging around the house. Today she wore yoga pants and a fitted sweater that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. "Walter, hi. Daniel's not home from work yet," she said, not moving aside to let me in. "I came to see Tommy," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Is he around?" She hesitated for just a moment too long. "He's napping. You know how cranky he gets when his schedule is disrupted." This was odd. Tommy had stopped taking regular naps months ago, and it was barely 3 o'clock in the afternoon, but I didn't push it. Instead, I decided to address what I'd witnessed. "Allison, I couldn't help but notice you throwing something away when I arrived. Was that Tommy's blanket?" Her expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. "Oh, that old thing? Yes, it was getting disgusting. You know how kids are with their security objects. It was falling apart, and honestly, it smelled terrible no matter how many times I washed it." I felt a knot forming in my stomach. That blanket meant a lot to Martha. She made it specifically for Tommy. Allison shrugged, a gesture that seemed deliberately careless. "I understand it has sentimental value, Walter, but Tommy is 5 now. He needs to learn to sleep without a baby blanket. It's not healthy for him to be so attached to material things." The way she said material things made it clear she had no understanding of what that blanket represented. It wasn't just fabric and yarn. It was Martha's final gift to her great-grandson, a tangible connection to the grandmother he'd barely known. but who had loved him from the moment she learned he was coming. Could I take it? I asked, the words coming out before I could stop them. If you're throwing it away anyway, I'd like to keep it, for the memories. For a split second, panic flashed across Allison's face. Then she forced another smile. I'm sorry, Walter, but the garbage truck comes early tomorrow morning. I already put it out there, and honestly, it's probably better if we just let it go. Sometimes holding on to these things makes it harder to move forward. Move forward from what? I wondered, but I didn't ask. Instead, I nodded and made small talk for a few more minutes before saying I'd come back when Daniel was home. Allison seemed relieved to close the door behind me, but I didn't leave. I sat in my car until I saw Allison's car pull out of the driveway about 15 minutes later. Then I got out and walked directly to their trash bin. My hands shook as I lifted the lid. The blanket was right there on top, and when I pulled it out, I could smell the familiar scent of the fabric softener Martha always used. The blanket wasn't disgusting at all. It was clean, soft, and showed only the normal wear you'd expect from a well-loved child's comfort object. I folded it carefully and put it in my car, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. Why had Allison lied? Why throw away something so precious? And why had she seemed almost panicked when I offered to take it? As I drove home, I kept glancing at the blanket on my passenger seat. Something about this whole situation felt deeply wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on what it was. All I knew was that Martha's final gift to Tommy was safe now, and whatever Allison's reasons were for throwing it away, they would have to remain her secret. At least that's what I thought until I got home and really examined what I'd rescued from that trash bin. Back home in my empty house, I carried Tommy's blanket directly to my bedroom and spread it carefully across the bed Martha and I had shared for so many years. In the soft afternoon light filtering through the curtains, I could see every detail of Martha's handiwork, the intricate pattern she'd created, the way she'd reinforced certain areas where she knew an active little boy would put the most stress on the fabric. I ran my fingers along the edges, remembering how excited Martha had been when she started this project. She'd bought the yarn on a Tuesday and had shown me the different blues she'd chosen, explaining how she wanted the blanket to feel like being wrapped in a summer sky. Her arthritis was already bothering her then, but she'd insisted on making something special for our first grandchild. As I examined the blanket more closely, something felt off. Not wrong exactly, but different than I remembered. The blanket seemed slightly heavier than it should be, and when I pressed down on certain areas I could feel something rigid beneath the soft yarn. At first I thought maybe Martha had used a different type of backing or interfacing to make the blanket more durable. But then I found a spot near Tommy's embroidered name where the stitching looked different. It was still expertly done, but the thread was a slightly different shade of blue, and the pattern didn't quite match Martha's distinctive style. This section looked like it had been opened and re-sewn, carefully but by different hands. My heart began to race as the implications hit me. Someone had hidden something inside this blanket, and it wasn't Martha. She would never have kept secrets from me, especially not about something she was making for Tommy. We'd been married for over 4 decades, and we'd shared everything. I went to Martha's old sewing box, which I'd kept exactly as she'd left it. Her small scissors were still there, sharp and precise. My hands trembled as I picked them up. I'd never damaged anything Martha had made, never altered her work in any way, but I had to know what was hidden inside. Carefully, I snipped the stitches along the seam that looked different. The thread came away easily, too easily, confirming my suspicion that this had been opened and re-sewn recently. As the seam opened, I could see something white tucked inside the padding. What I pulled out made my stomach drop to the floor. Photographs. A stack of photographs that had no business being hidden in my grandson's baby blanket. The first photo showed Allison, but not the Allison I knew. This was Allison in a red dress I'd never seen, laughing at something off camera, her hand resting intimately on the chest of a man who definitely wasn't my son Daniel. The man was tall, dark-haired, and had his arm wrapped around her waist in a way that spoke of familiarity, of comfort, of something much more than friendship. My hands shook as I looked at the next photo. Same man, same intimate positioning, but this time they were kissing. Not a friendly peck on the cheek, but a deep, passionate kiss that made it clear this wasn't some innocent encounter. Allison's wedding ring was clearly visible on the hand she had pressed against his face. Photo after photo revealed the same story. Allison with this stranger in restaurants I didn't recognize, in what looked like hotel rooms, in situations that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. Some of the photos looked recent, taken within the last few months based on Allison's haircut and clothes I recognized. Others seemed older, possibly dating back a year or more. I sank onto the edge of the bed, the photographs scattered around me like evidence of a crime I'd never wanted to discover. My mind reeled with questions, each one more disturbing than the last. How long had this been going on? Who was this man? And why were these photos hidden in Tommy's blanket? But it was the last photo in the stack that made everything infinitely worse. It showed Allison and the mystery man together on what looked like a beach, somewhere tropical. She was wearing a bikini that showed her flat stomach, and based on her appearance, this photo had been taken at least 2 years ago. The date stamp in the corner confirmed my worst fear. This photo was taken just 3 months before Tommy was born. I felt sick to my stomach as the timeline became clear. Allison had been having an affair not just recently, but during her pregnancy with Tommy. During the months when Martha was lovingly crocheting this blanket, when Daniel was excitedly preparing for fatherhood, when our entire family was celebrating the coming arrival of our first grandchild. The room seemed to spin around me as I tried to process what this meant. I thought about Tommy's face, his features that I'd always assumed he'd inherited from Daniel's side of the family. But now I found myself remembering moments when I'd noticed things that didn't quite add up. The way Tommy's hair curled differently than Daniel's had as a child, his eye color that was just slightly off from what I'd expected, small details I'd dismissed because I wanted to see the family resemblance I was looking for. I picked up each photograph again, studying the mystery man's face more carefully. He was handsome in a rugged way, with the kind of strong jawline and broad shoulders that women found attractive. But there was something familiar about him that I couldn't quite place. Had I seen him somewhere before? Was he someone from Allison's past, or a more recent addition to her life? The more I studied the photos, the more questions arose. If Allison was having an affair, why keep photographic evidence? And more importantly, why hide that evidence in Tommy's blanket? It seemed like an incredibly risky place to store something so damaging. Unless she'd been planning to take the blanket with her somewhere. Maybe she'd been preparing to leave Daniel and wanted to keep the photos close but hidden. But then why throw the blanket away now? What had changed? I gathered the photographs and put them back in order, trying to piece together a timeline. The beach photo was clearly the oldest. Then there were several that looked like they'd been taken in the fall, around the time Tommy would have been born. The most recent ones showed Allison with shorter hair, the style she'd adopted just a few months ago. This affair wasn't a brief indiscretion or a momentary lapse in judgment. This was an ongoing relationship that had lasted at least through Tommy's birth and possibly continued to this day. The man in these photos wasn't just Allison's lover. He might very well be Tommy's biological father. The thought hit me like a physical blow. Tommy, the little boy I'd grown to love so deeply, might not be my biological grandson at all. Every moment I'd spent with him, every time I'd looked into his eyes and seen Martha's sparkle, every story I'd told him about his family history, it might all be based on a lie. But even as that devastating possibility sank in, another realization was forming. Biology didn't change the love I felt for Tommy. Regardless of who his biological father was, he was still the little boy who ran to greet me when I visited, who asked me to read him stories, who called me Grandpa with such pure affection. DNA couldn't erase the bond we'd formed. What did matter was the deception. If Allison had been living a lie for over 5 years, if she'd allowed Daniel to believe he was raising his own son when she knew otherwise, then she was capable of a level of cruelty I'd never imagined. And if she was still involved with this other man, then my son was living in a marriage built on fundamental dishonesty. I needed to know more. I needed to understand who this man was and what role he played in Allison's current life. But I also needed to be careful. These photographs were damaging evidence, but they were also potentially explosive information that could destroy my son's life and tear apart Tommy's world. As I sat there surrounded by the remnants of Martha's final gift and the evidence of Allison's betrayal, I realized that my quiet retirement had just taken a very dark turn. I had to find out who this man was, and I had to decide what to do with the truth I'd uncovered. But most importantly, I had to figure out how to protect the people I loved from the fallout that was sure to come. Sleep didn't come that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the photographs locked away in Martha's jewelry box where I'd hidden them after studying every detail until my eyes burned. The questions multiplied in my mind like weeds, each one more troubling than the last. By dawn, I knew I couldn't let this rest. I had to find out who this man was, even if I wasn't ready to face what that knowledge might bring. I'd never been much for technology. Martha had been the one who figured out the computer, who learned to use the internet to look up recipes and stay in touch with distant relatives. But I remembered enough to know that people's lives were scattered across social media these days, their secrets hidden in plain sight if you knew where to look. Daniel had helped me set up a Facebook account after Martha died, thinking it might help me feel less isolated. I'd barely used it, but I remembered the basics. That morning, with coffee growing cold beside me, I logged in and began what felt like detective work. I started with Allison's profile, something I'd never really examined closely before. Her photos were carefully curated, showing only the perfect moments of family life. There was Daniel looking proud at Tommy's birthday parties, vacation shots from places I knew they couldn't really afford, countless pictures of Tommy at various stages of growing up. The image she projected was of a woman living a blessed life with her devoted husband and adorable son, but I was looking at these photos with different eyes now. In some of the pictures, I could see strain around Allison's smile, a tension in her posture when she was standing next to Daniel. There were also gaps in the timeline that I'd never noticed before, periods where she hadn't posted anything for weeks, times when Daniel appeared in photos but looked tired or distant. It was when I started looking at the people who regularly liked and commented on Allison's posts that I found him. The name jumped out at me from a comment on a photo of Tommy at a playground. Rick Morrison, just 2 words, cute kid. But something about seeing that name connected to Tommy's photo made my stomach clench. I clicked on Rick Morrison's profile and there he was. The man from the photographs grinning at the camera in his profile picture with the same confident smile I'd seen in those intimate shots with Allison. My hands trembled as I scrolled through his timeline, looking for any connection to my family. What I found was worse than I'd imagined. Rick Morrison wasn't some stranger Allison had met online or through work. He was Daniel's best friend from college. I found photo after photo of Daniel and Rick together over the years. There they were at Daniel's wedding to Allison, Rick standing right beside him as best man. There was Rick at Tommy's baptism, holding my grandson with the easy familiarity of someone who'd been around since the beginning. The betrayal cut deeper than I'd thought possible. This wasn't just adultery. This was the most fundamental violation of trust imaginable. Rick had stood at Daniel's wedding, had promised to support their marriage, had been welcomed into our family as a trusted friend, and all the while, he'd been carrying on an affair with Daniel's wife. I scrolled back through years of posts, looking for clues I'd missed. Rick was a frequent presence in the early years of Daniel and Allison's marriage. He appeared in group photos from dinner parties, weekend trips, holiday gatherings. He was the single friend who was always included, the guy Daniel joked about needing to find a nice girl to settle down with. But as I looked more carefully at the timing of posts and photos, a pattern emerged that made me sick to my stomach. In the months leading up to Tommy's birth, Rick had been around constantly. There were photos of him helping Daniel paint the nursery, joking about teaching Tommy to play baseball, talking about being Uncle Rick to the baby. The beach photo I'd found in the blanket made horrible sense now. I recognized the location from some of Daniel's older posts. It was the same resort where Daniel and Allison had taken their honeymoon, but the timestamp on the hidden photo showed it was taken 3 years later, during a weekend when Daniel had been away on a business trip. I found his post from that same weekend, complaining about having to work while everyone else was enjoying the summer weather. While Daniel was working overtime to provide for his growing family, his wife and best friend were recreating their honeymoon in the same place where Daniel thought he'd started his happily ever after. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. Every milestone in Tommy's life, Rick had been there, not just as an observer, but as someone who might very well be the biological father watching his own son grow up while his best friend remained oblivious. I thought about all the times Daniel had joked about Rick being like a brother to Tommy, how the 3 of them were such a tight unit. I found myself studying photos of Tommy with new eyes, comparing his features to Rick's rather than Daniel's. The resemblance was subtle but undeniable once I was looking for it. Tommy had Rick's nose the same way his hair grew in a slight cowlick at the back of his head. Even his smile, which I'd always thought was uniquely Tommy's, had echoes of Rick's confident grin. But it was when I found Rick's relationship status that everything became crystal clear. He was listed as single, but his recent posts told a different story. There were subtle references to spending time with someone special, photos taken in restaurants I recognized from Allison's own posts, always cropped to show just his portion of the table but clearly taken during shared meals. Most damning was a photo from just 2 weeks ago. Rick had posted a picture of his hand holding a coffee cup, and in the background, blurred but recognizable, was Allison's distinctive silver bracelet on another hand reaching for sugar packets. The photo was time-stamped on a Tuesday morning, the same day Allison had told Daniel she was having coffee with her sister. The affair wasn't just ongoing, it was current, active and happening right under Daniel's nose. While my son went to work every day to support his family, his wife was meeting with his best friend, continuing a relationship that had been going on for at least 5 years. I closed the laptop and sat in the silence of my empty house, feeling the weight of knowledge I'd never wanted to possess. This wasn't just about infidelity anymore. This was about a child who might not know his real father, about a man who was pouring his love and resources into raising another man's son, while that man watched from the sidelines. But there was something else bothering me, something beyond the immediate shock of discovery. Why had these photos been hidden in Tommy's blanket? If Allison was still seeing Rick, if their relationship was ongoing, why keep old photographs sewn into a child's comfort object? It seemed like an unnecessary risk, a strange place to hide evidence of an affair, unless the photos weren't just sentimental keepsakes, unless they served some other purpose that I hadn't figured out yet. Maybe they were insurance, leverage of some kind. Or maybe there was more to this story than even the photographs revealed. I thought about the way Allison had reacted when I offered to take the blanket, the flash of panic in her eyes, the insistence that it needed to be thrown away completely. She hadn't just been discarding Tommy's comfort object, she'd been trying to destroy evidence. But evidence of what, exactly? The photos proved the affair, but Allison could probably survive that revelation if she played it right. Daniel loved her, and more importantly, he loved Tommy. Even if he learned about the affair, he might be willing to work through it for the sake of their son. People forgave infidelity all the time, especially when children were involved. But what if there was more? What if the photos were just the beginning of what Allison had been hiding? I realized I needed help, needed someone with skills I didn't possess to dig deeper into this situation. The thought of hiring a private investigator seemed like something out of a movie, but I was dealing with a situation that felt increasingly unreal. My quiet life had been turned upside down by photographs hidden in a baby blanket, and I needed to understand the full scope of what I was dealing with before I decided how to proceed. Most importantly, I needed to know for certain whether Tommy was Daniel's biological son, because regardless of what I decided to do about Allison and Rick, Daniel deserved to know the truth about the child he was raising as his own. The private investigator's office was nothing like what I'd expected. Instead of the gritty, cigarette-stained space I'd imagined from old movies, Patricia Webb worked out of a clean, modern office building downtown. She was a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a straightforward manner that put me at ease immediately. "Mr. Henderson," she said as I settled into the chair across from her desk, "you mentioned on the phone that this involves your family. Before we go any further, I need you to understand that sometimes the truth isn't what people want to hear. Are you prepared for that possibility?" I thought about the photographs still hidden in Martha's jewelry box, about the sleepless nights I'd spent since finding them. I'm not sure anyone's ever really prepared for the truth when it's going to hurt people you love, but I need to know what's really going on. I told her everything. About finding the blanket, about the hidden photographs, about discovering that Rick Morrison was Daniel's best friend. Patricia listened without interrupting, taking notes in a neat handwriting that reminded me of Martha's. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and studied me carefully. "You realize that if Tommy isn't your son's biological child, confirming that fact will change everything for your family," she said. "There's no putting that knowledge back once it's out there." "I understand," I replied, though I wasn't sure I really did. "But my son deserves to know the truth, and Tommy deserves to know who his real father is." Patricia nodded slowly. "All right. Let me explain what I can do. First, I can conduct a thorough background investigation on both Allison and Rick Morrison, financial records, travel patterns, communication records where legally accessible. Second, I can document their current relationship if it's ongoing. Third, regarding paternity, there are ways to obtain genetic material for testing without involving the subjects directly. The clinical way she discussed it made it seem almost routine, but I knew there was nothing routine about what we were contemplating. We were talking about potentially destroying a marriage and revealing that a 5-year-old boy's entire understanding of his family was based on lies. "How long would something like this take?" I asked. "Depends on what we find and how deep you want me to dig. Initial background checks and surveillance can be done within a week or two. Genetic testing would take longer to arrange and execute properly. We're looking at maybe a month for a comprehensive investigation." A month felt like an eternity, but I knew this couldn't be rushed. Too much was at stake to risk making mistakes. I agreed to her terms and left her office with a sick feeling in my stomach and a business card that felt like it weighed 100 pounds. Over the next few days, I tried to maintain my normal routine, but everything felt different. When Daniel called to check on me, his voice sounded strained in ways I'd never noticed before. When he mentioned that Allison had been stressed about work lately, I found myself wondering what was really bothering her. Every innocent comment took on new meaning when filtered through what I now knew. The hardest part was seeing Tommy. Daniel brought him over for our usual Sunday afternoon visit, and I watched my grandson play with the toy cars I kept at my house, chattering about kindergarten and his friends. He seemed happy and secure, completely unaware that his entire world might be built on deception. Part of me wondered if ignorance might be kinder for him, at least for now. "Grandpa, why do you look sad?" Tommy asked during one of our Sunday visits, climbing onto my lap with the directness that only small children possess. "I'm not sad, buddy," I lied, smoothing his hair back from his forehead. "Sometimes grown-ups just have things on their minds. Daddy has things on his mind too," Tommy said thoughtfully. "Mommy says it's because work is hard, but I think maybe Daddy is sad about something else." The observation hit me like a punch to the chest. Even a 5-year-old could sense that something was wrong in his parents' marriage. How long had Daniel been carrying concerns he couldn't name? How many signs had there been that I'd missed because I wasn't looking for them? Patricia called me on a Thursday afternoon, 2 weeks after our initial meeting. Her voice was carefully neutral, but I could hear something underneath that made my palms sweat. "Mr. Henderson, I need to meet with you in person. Can you come to my office tomorrow morning? Did you find something?" I found quite a bit, but this isn't a conversation for the phone. I barely slept that night. By the time I arrived at Patricia's office the next morning, I felt like I'd aged years in the span of weeks. She had a thick folder on her desk and several printed photographs spread out beside it. "I'll start with what you probably suspected," she said, without preamble. "Allison Morrison and Rick Morrison are definitely having an ongoing affair. I have photographic evidence of them meeting regularly, always when your son is at work. They're not being particularly careful about it anymore, which suggests they've been doing this for a long time." She showed me photos of Allison and Rick entering and leaving hotels, sharing meals, walking together with the easy intimacy of a long-term couple. In one particularly damning image, they were kissing in the parking lot of a restaurant just 3 miles from Daniel's office. "But that's not the most interesting part," Patricia continued. "The financial investigation revealed some troubling patterns. Allison has been receiving regular payments from Rick Morrison for the past 4 years. $500 a month deposited into a separate account that your son apparently doesn't know about." My mouth went dry. Payments for what? That's where things get complicated. Based on what I've been able to piece together, I believe Rick Morrison knows he's Tommy's biological father. The payments started exactly 6 months after Tommy was born, and they've continued without interruption. It appears to be child support, but it's being paid secretly. The implications hit me in waves. Rick wasn't just Allison's lover, he was Tommy's father, and he'd been financially supporting his son while letting Daniel believe the child was his. The level of deception was staggering. "There's more," Patricia said grimly. "The payments increased significantly 8 months ago. Right around the time your son got his promotion at work. Instead of $500 a month, Rick started paying $1,500. I believe Allison has been blackmailing him." "Blackmailing him with what?" Patricia pulled out another photograph, this one clearly taken from a distance with a telephoto lens. It showed Rick with a woman I didn't recognize, both of them wearing wedding rings that gleamed in the sunlight. "Rick Morrison got married 6 months ago," Patricia explained, "to a woman named Sarah Chen, a successful attorney from a prominent family. Based on what I could find out about her, she comes from old money and has very traditional values about marriage and family. If she found out that her new husband had been having an affair for years and had secretly fathered a child with his best friend's wife, it would destroy him financially and socially." I stared at the photograph, trying to process what this meant. "So Allison is threatening to expose him unless he pays her more money?" "That's my assessment. And I think the photographs you found in the blanket were part of her insurance policy. She's been keeping evidence of their relationship, probably including proof that he's Tommy's father. When she decided to demand more money, she needed that evidence close at hand, but hidden from your son. But why throw the blanket away now?" Patricia's expression grew even more serious. "Because I think she's planning something bigger. The increased payments suggest she's getting greedier, more confident, and there's something else you need to know." She pulled out a final set of documents. "Allison has been researching divorce attorneys, not just looking at websites, but actually meeting with them. She's been asking about custody arrangements and asset division in cases involving paternity questions." The room seemed to spin around me. "She's planning to leave Daniel. It appears that way. And based on the timeline, I think she's been building toward this for months. The increased blackmail payments from Rick, the hidden evidence, the legal consultations, it all points to someone preparing for a major life change." I felt like I was drowning in the complexity of what my daughter-in-law had orchestrated. She wasn't just having an affair, she was running a sophisticated operation designed to extract maximum financial benefit from multiple sources. She was blackmailing her lover, deceiving her husband, and preparing to blow up her son's life when it became convenient for her. "What about Tommy?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "What happens to him in all this?" Patricia's expression softened slightly. "That depends on what you decide to do with this information. If Allison follows through with her apparent plan, Tommy is going to learn some very difficult truths about his parentage, but if she's exposed before she can control the narrative, there might be a chance to minimize the damage to him." I left Patricia's office with copies of everything she'd found, my mind reeling with the scope of Allison's deception. This wasn't just about an affair anymore. This was about a woman who had systematically manipulated everyone around her for years, using her own child as leverage in an elaborate scheme to secure her financial future. But what haunted me most was the realization that Tommy was caught in the middle of all this, an innocent child whose entire understanding of his family was about to be shattered by the adults who were supposed to protect him. I spent 3 sleepless nights staring at Patricia's evidence spread across my kitchen table, trying to find the courage to do what I knew had to be done. The photographs, bank statements, and investigation reports painted a picture of betrayal so complete that it took my breath away. But knowing the truth and acting on it were 2 entirely different things. Every time I picked up the phone to call Daniel, I thought about Tommy. How do you tell a 5-year-old that everything he believes about his family is a lie? How do you explain that the man he calls daddy might not be his biological father, and that his real father has been watching from the sidelines his entire life? The weight of that responsibility felt crushing. But I also thought about Daniel, working long hours to support a family built on deception, trusting a woman who had been manipulating him since before their son was born. He deserved to know the truth, even if that truth would destroy the life he thought he was living. On Thursday morning, I finally made the call that would change everything. "Dad, hi," Daniel answered, and I could hear the genuine warmth in his voice. "I was just thinking about you. Allison mentioned you stopped by last week. Sorry I missed you." The casual mention of Allison made my stomach clench. "Daniel, I need to talk to you about something important. Can you come over this evening? Alone?" There was a pause. "Is everything okay? You sound strange." "Just come over after work. We need to have a conversation that's long overdue." That evening, as I watched Daniel's car pull into my driveway, I felt like I was about to detonate a bomb in my own family. He looked tired as he walked to my door, carrying the weight of providing for a household that was costing him more than just money. "Dad, you're scaring me," he said as soon as he stepped inside. "You look like someone died." In a way, someone had. The Daniel who trusted completely, who believed in the goodness of the people closest to him, was about to die, and I was the one who had to kill him. "Sit down, son," I said, my voice heavier than I'd ever heard it. "What I'm about to tell you is going to be difficult to hear, but you need to know the truth." I started with finding the blanket in the trash, watching Daniel's expression change from confusion to concern as I described Allison's reaction when I offered to take it. When I told him about the photographs hidden inside, his face went completely pale. "Dad, what are you saying?" I handed him the first photograph, the one of Allison kissing the mystery man. Daniel stared at it for a long moment, his hands beginning to shake. "Who is this?" he whispered. "Look closer at his face, Daniel." I watched my son study the photograph, saw the exact moment when recognition hit him. His face crumpled like he'd been physically struck. "Rick?" The name came out as barely a whisper. "This is Rick?" I nodded, hating myself for being the bearer of this devastating news. "Your best friend, your best man, the man you trusted with everything." Daniel's breathing became rapid and shallow. He looked through the other photographs with the mechanical movements of someone in shock, each image adding another layer to his devastation. When he saw the beach photo with the timestamp, he made a sound I'd never heard from him before, a wounded noise that came from somewhere deep in his chest. "She was pregnant," he said, staring at the photo. "She was pregnant with Tommy when this was taken." "Daniel, there's more. I hired a private investigator. If I thought he looked devastated before, it was nothing compared to his expression when I showed him Patricia's evidence. The bank statements showing Rick's payments to Allison, the photos of their ongoing affair, the evidence that Allison had been researching divorce attorneys. But it was when I explained Patricia's theory about the blackmail that Daniel finally broke. He put his head in his hands and sobbed like a child, his entire body shaking with the force of his grief. "Tommy," he whispered between sobs. "Is Tommy even my son?" "I don't know for certain," I admitted, "but Patricia thinks there's a strong possibility that Rick is his biological father." Daniel looked up at me with eyes that were completely shattered. "5 years, Dad. For 5 years I've been living a lie. Everything I thought I knew about my life, about my marriage, about my son, none of it's real." I sat beside him on the couch, the same couch where Martha and I had comforted him through childhood disappointments that now seemed insignificant by comparison. But this wasn't something that could be fixed with ice cream and reassurance. This was the kind of betrayal that changes a person permanently. "What am I supposed to do with this?" he asked, gesturing at the evidence scattered across my coffee table. "How do I face Allison knowing what I know? How do I look at Tommy and wonder if he's really my son?" "Tommy is your son in every way that matters," I said firmly. "Biology doesn't change the fact that you've raised him, loved him, been his father since the day he was born. Nothing can take that away." Daniel wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "But she's been lying to me about everything. The whole foundation of our marriage is built on deception. And Rick," his voice broke again, "Rick has been watching me raise his child while pretending to be my friend. How is that not sick?" There was no good answer to that question. The level of betrayal was so complete, so deliberately cruel, that it defied understanding. Two people he'd trusted completely had conspired to deceive him about the most fundamental aspects of his life. "I need to confront them," Daniel said suddenly, standing up with a new energy born of anger. "I need to hear them admit what they've done." "Daniel, wait," I said, grabbing his arm. "Think about this carefully. Once you confront them, there's no going back. Everything changes permanently. Everything has already changed, Dad. The only difference is that now I know the truth." He was right, of course. The moment I'd found those photographs, the old version of Daniel's life had ended. Now the only question was how the new version would begin. "If you're going to do this," I said, "don't do it alone. I'll come with you." Daniel looked at me with surprise. Dad, this isn't your fight. Yes, it is. Tommy is my grandson regardless of biology. You're my son. This family has been under attack for years and we didn't even know it. If we're going to face this, we face it together. That night, we planned what felt like a military operation. Daniel would call Allison and ask her to come over to my house, saying he needed to discuss something about Tommy's schedule. He would also call Rick, asking him to come by to help with a problem. We would confront them together with all the evidence laid out where they couldn't deny or minimize what they'd done. What if Rick doesn't come? Daniel asked. He'll come, I said with certainty. He's been playing this game for too long to risk having it exposed without getting a chance to control the narrative. As Daniel prepared to make the calls, I thought about Martha and how she would have handled this situation. She'd always been better at navigating emotional complexities, at finding ways to protect the people she loved while still insisting on honesty. I wished desperately that she was here to guide us through what was about to happen, but Martha was gone. And this was something Daniel and I had to face on our own. Tomorrow evening, the careful web of lies that Allison and Rick had constructed would finally be torn apart. After 5 years of deception, the truth was finally going to come to light. I just hoped we were all strong enough to survive what that truth would reveal. The confrontation took place in my living room on a Friday evening that felt like the end of the world. Allison arrived first, looking perfectly put together as always, though I noticed a tension around her eyes that hadn't been there before. She seemed surprised to see all the papers spread across my coffee table but didn't comment on them. "Where's Tommy?" Daniel asked, his voice carefully controlled. "At my mother's house for the weekend," Allison replied, settling into the chair across from us. "You said this was about his schedule?" "In a way," Daniel said just as the doorbell rang. Rick walked in with the easy confidence of someone who'd been welcome in our family for years, clapping Daniel on the shoulder with the casual affection that now made my skin crawl. He looked around the room, taking in the serious atmosphere and the evidence scattered across the table. "What's all this about?" he asked, but I could see a flicker of recognition in his eyes as he spotted some of the photographs. Daniel stood up slowly, holding the picture of Rick and Allison kissing. "I think you know exactly what this is about." The change in the room was immediate and electric. Allison went completely still, her face draining of color. Rick's confident demeanor evaporated, replaced by the trapped look of an animal caught in headlights. "Daniel, I can explain," Allison started, but he held up his hand to stop her. "No more lies," he said, his voice steady despite the pain I could see in his eyes. "I know about the affair. I know about the money Rick's been paying you. I know about the divorce attorneys you've been consulting. I know everything." Rick sank into a chair, his head in his hands. "How long have you known?" "Long enough to understand that my entire marriage has been a lie," Daniel replied. "The question I need answered now is simple. Is Tommy my son?" The silence that followed was deafening. I watched Allison's face, saw her calculating, trying to figure out if there was still a way to salvage her situation, but Rick surprised everyone by speaking first. "No," he said quietly, not looking up from his hands. "Tommy is my son." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Even though we'd suspected it, hearing it confirmed out loud was devastating. Daniel made that wounded sound again, the one that came from somewhere deep in his chest. "How long?" Daniel asked, his voice breaking. "How long have you both known?" Allison finally found her voice. "Since before he was born. But Daniel, you have to understand." "Understand what?" Daniel exploded, his carefully maintained composure finally cracking. "Understand that my wife and my best friend have been lying to me for 5 years? Understand that I've been raising another man's child while he pays you blackmail money to keep quiet about it? What exactly am I supposed to understand about that?" "You love Tommy," Allison said desperately. "You've always been his father in every way that matters. This doesn't have to change anything." I saw Daniel flinch at her words and I couldn't stay silent anymore. "It changes everything," I said, standing up. "You've stolen 5 years of his life based on lies. You've let him pour his heart and soul into raising a child while the biological father watched from the sidelines, and now you have the audacity to suggest that it doesn't matter?" Rick finally looked up, his face streaked with tears. "Daniel, I never wanted it to happen this way. I was going to tell you after Tommy was born, but then Allison said it would destroy you. She said it was better if you never knew." "Better for who?" Daniel asked, his voice like ice. "Better for you? Better for her? Because it sure as hell wasn't better for me." "The money," I said, addressing Rick directly. "How long have you been paying her to keep quiet?" Rick wiped his eyes with his sleeve. "Since Tommy was 6 months old. She said if I wanted to be part of his life in any way, I had to contribute financially, but I had to do it secretly so you wouldn't find out." "And when you got married?" Daniel asked. "Did that change anything?" Allison and Rick exchanged a look that told me everything I needed to know. "She demanded more money," Rick admitted. "Said that since I was marrying into money, I could afford to support my son properly. She threatened to tell Sarah everything if I didn't pay." "So you've been blackmailing him," Daniel said to Allison, his voice filled with disgust. "Your own lover, the father of your child. You've been extorting money from him while living off my salary and letting me believe I was supporting my own family." Allison stood up abruptly, her mask finally slipping completely. You want to know the truth, Daniel? Fine. Yes, I've been with Rick since before Tommy was born. Yes, Tommy is his son. But you know what? You should be grateful. You gotta be a father to a beautiful boy without any of the complications of the relationship that created him. The callousness of her words took my breath away. Daniel stared at her like he was seeing her for the first time, which in many ways he was. Grateful? He repeated slowly. You think I should be grateful that you turned my entire life into a lie? I gave you what you wanted, Allison continued, her voice growing harder. A family, a son, a life that looked perfect from the outside. The only thing that's changed is that now you know the details. The details? Daniel's voice was rising now. The details are that you've been cheating on me with my best friend, extorting money from him and planning to divorce me while I raised his child. Those aren't details, Allison. That's betrayal on a level I didn't even know was possible. Rick stood up, reaching toward Daniel. Dan, please, let me explain. Don't touch me, Daniel said, stepping back. Don't you dare try to explain this. You stood at my wedding as my best man while planning to steal my wife. You held my son at his baptism knowing he was yours. You've sat at my dinner table, been welcomed into my family, pretended to be my friend while living this massive lie. There's nothing you can say that could possibly explain that. I watched my son's face and saw something I'd never seen there before. A cold, determined anger that reminded me of Martha when she'd made up her mind about something. Daniel walked over to the coffee table and picked up all of Patricia's evidence, organizing it into a neat stack. Here's what's going to happen, he said, his voice deadly calm. Allison, you're going to pack your things and leave my house tonight. You can stay wherever you want, but you're not spending another night under my roof. Daniel, please, she started, but he continued as if she hadn't spoken. Rick, you're going to tell your wife about Tommy, about everything, because if you don't, I will. She deserves to know who she married. Rick went even paler. Daniel, that will destroy my marriage. Good, Daniel replied without a trace of sympathy. You destroyed mine. What about Tommy? Allison asked, and for the first time I heard genuine fear in her voice. Daniel's expression softened slightly when he talked about his son. Tommy has done nothing wrong in any of this. He's an innocent child caught in the middle of your selfishness. I'm going to continue being his father because that's what I've been for 5 years, and I'm not going to abandon him because of your choices. But Rick is his biological father, Allison pressed. Don't you think Tommy has a right to know that? Tommy has a right to stability and love, which is something you clearly never considered, Daniel replied. When he's old enough to understand, we'll figure out how to tell him the truth in a way that protects him, but that decision will be made by the people who actually have his best interests at heart. Allison tried one more desperate gambit. You can't just throw away 5 years of marriage, Daniel. Think about what we've built together. Daniel looked at her with something that might have been pity. We didn't build anything together, Allison. You built a house of lies, and I was just the foundation you used to support it. But foundations can be rebuilt on solid ground. Rick and Allison left that night, their web of deception finally torn apart. Rick went home to face his wife, with the truth that would likely end his marriage. Allison went to pack her belongings and begin the process of facing the consequences of her choices. Daniel and I sat in my living room after they left, surrounded by the evidence of betrayal, but also somehow feeling lighter than we had in weeks. What happens now? Daniel asked. Now we heal, I said simply. We focus on Tommy, we focus on our family, and we rebuild from the truth instead of lies. Will you help me? He asked. And I heard the little boy he'd once been in that question. Always, I promised. That's what families do. 3 months later, I was sitting in that same living room, but this time Tommy was on the floor playing with his toy cars, while Daniel graded papers at my kitchen table. The custody arrangement had been worked out quickly once Rick's wife filed for divorce, and he lost his leverage over Allison. Daniel had primary custody, and Tommy had adjusted better than any of us had dared hope. The little boy still called me Grandpa, still ran to greet me when Daniel brought him over, still asked me to read him stories about his family history, because regardless of biology, regardless of the lies that had surrounded his birth, he was still our Tommy, still the bright light that had brought joy into our lives when Martha's death had left them so dark. Allison had moved across the country, visiting Tommy during scheduled times, but no longer able to manipulate the situation to her advantage. Rick paid child support through the courts now, all above board, all documented. The secret payments and blackmail were things of the past. Daniel was healing slowly, learning to trust again, building a new life based on honesty instead of deception. He was a different man now, stronger in some ways, more cautious in others, but fundamentally still the good person Martha and I had raised him to be. And I had Martha's blanket back where it belonged, cleaned and mended, waiting on Tommy's bed for the nights when he needed the comfort of something made with love. The photos that had been hidden inside were evidence in legal proceedings now. But the blanket itself had been restored to its original purpose, providing comfort and security to a child who needed to know he was loved. Sometimes the truth destroys everything you thought you knew about your life. But sometimes, if you're very lucky, it also sets you free to build something better on solid ground. We were the lucky ones, Tommy and Daniel and I. We had each other, we had the truth, and we had the chance to move forward together. That was more than enough.